The first session of this year's G20 has concluded, and the draft communique says today's era must not be of war. In the opening remarks, Indonesian President Joko Widodo urged members to avoid another world war.
Being responsible here also means that we must end the war. If the war does not end, it will be difficult for the world to move forward. If the war does not end, it will be difficult for us to take responsibility for the future of current generation and future generations. We should not divide the world into parts. We must not allow the world fall into another Cold War.
Food and energy security has become the top priority. It is a fallout of the war in Ukraine and also because of the plunge in the world economy. This is exactly what was discussed in the first session. The group of 20, including Russia, will deplore the economic impact of the Ukraine conflict. Meanwhile, most members have condemned the war. Chinese President Xi Jinping warned the bloc against the quote-unquote weaponization of food and energy. Countries that are not remotely involved in the war are also facing the brunt, like Indonesia, which is the host country this year. To understand the impact, our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidan Sibyl, spoke to Indonesia's Information Technology Minister. Listen in.
Do you believe that the communique will come out tomorrow? Has it been agreed?
I just mentioned we are very optimistic and the team still working on it.
The July agreement to get Ukrainian grain moving again was a breakthrough. It helped the poorer nations cope with food shortages around the world. Last month, it had hit a roadblock when Putin briefly walked away from the agreement. Even though the plan is now up and running, Western leaders will try to put a mechanism in place to avert these issues in the future. Now, ahead of the first session, Ukrainian president called the summit a group of 19, addressing the absence of the Russian president. Zelensky called on the G20 leaders to adopt a 10-point peace formula and end the war. The United States expects the G20 to condemn Russia for the war in Ukraine. The COVID-19 pandemic was way up on the agenda until last year, but the focus has now shifted to the post-COVID phase. World leaders have gathered to discuss this in the second session of the day. The virus still exists, but the countries seem ready to move to the next phase. Now joining us from the ground is our principal diplomatic correspondent, Sidan Sibyl, from Bali. Hello to you, Sidan. Now, the first session has concluded of the G20. We have seen the draft communique saying today's era must not be an era of war. What was the general consensus among world leaders on this and the ripple effects from the war in Ukraine?
Well, the Russia-Ukraine war has dominated this year's G20 summit here in Bali. We know that the Sherpas burned the midnight oil essentially to come out with a communique. The communique will be released once the summit is over tomorrow. And this is a communique that required a lot of bridging the divide between West and Russia, and many developing countries and emerging economies like India and Indonesia played an important role. And what is interesting is what WION has learned, that the communique mentions that famous line of the Indian Prime Minister to the Russian President, that this is not an era of war, when they had bilateral meeting in Samarkand, being mentioned in the joint statement, the G20 joint statement. This is a big development for India, given the fact that India has been seen as a country which is neutral and play an important role in terms of diffusing the tensions between Ukraine and Russia, and has been reiterating the call for diplomatic solution. In fact, earlier today, when the Indian Prime Minister made his intervention, he talked about a resolution of the Ukraine conflict via diplomacy.
Right, Siddhanta. And another theme that was discussed this year at the summit, which was the main item on the agenda last year, is, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic. This year, the focus has shifted to a post-COVID phase. What has been discussed among the global leaders here?
Well, one of the key sessions in this year's G20 Summit has been on health. The session, of course, has now been concluded a short while ago. And of course, India has been focusing on how, in a post-COVID world, supply chains can be built which are resilient. In fact, there are two sessions which happened today. The first was on food and energy security, in which the Indian Prime Minister specifically called out on criticality of supply chains which have been disrupted by COVID pandemic, climate change and the Ukraine conflict. So that remains India's focus. But largely when it comes to COVID crisis, we saw that G20, the summit in 2020 took place virtually in Saudi Arabia. It has, of course, happened in person last year in Italy, and this is second time in a row it's happening in person. And that in-person meeting does provide a lot of ample of opportunity for the world leaders to engage informally. So there are, of course, a lot of photo ops, happy faces, but the big question is, can these conversations be translated into very cooperative means between various countries when it comes to the G20 summit?
Absolutely, Siddhant. Thank you.
WION, now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.